So this video is about whether or not this Pelican G3 GameCube controller is a good buy in 2021. Now, why would we even be talking about this? The reason is that these genuine GameCube controllers can be outrageously expensive, like 50 bucks sometimes to get a good one. And that's a lot to pay for a 20-year-old game controller. Now, obviously there are new GameCube compatible controllers, like this piece of junk, made by a billion generic Chinese manufacturers, and these are just the worst. They don't last very long, and the sensitivity of the joysticks is just completely wrong. So these can cost $5 sometimes. This is just not an option. And this, if you can get it, is good, but actually they tend to be worn out now, so they might not be the best. So the question is, would you be better off with this? Now, this is also a third-party controller, but it's not generic like that white one that I had. It's made by a real company. It's made by Pelican Controllers, or Pelican something or other, more recently known as PDP. And I don't know what this sold for new, but nowadays you can get these for $10, $15 on eBay, which is a heck of a lot better than the real thing. Let me just point out that in terms of the sensitivity on the joysticks, these Pelican controllers are just as good as the original. That is to say, if you push the controller a little bit, your character moves slowly. If you push it a lot, he moves at full speed. And the sensitivity range on these joysticks seems to be just as accurate as it is on the GameCube. So that's very important and something that the generic controllers don't seem to provide. So the question is, how does it feel in your hand, how the buttons feel, etc., etc. Now, if you look at these side by side, I would say they're very close in size. I think the Pelican maybe has just a tiny bit of growth relative to the real thing. It's just a little fatter. They feel pretty close in your hands, like I think a pro might be able to tell the difference blindfolded, but as an amateur who just wants to play some Mario Sunshine, this is close enough. Now, obviously, if your goal here is to play Smash Brothers, you probably know that you need one of these. So this is really more aimed towards the aficionado who wants to play a Mario game or maybe a Zelda game or something like that. So let's just go through the buttons. So first off, we've got the A button. On a real GameCube, it's actually a fairly soft touch, like there's a bit of a tactile response, but it's not very strong. On here, yeah, you can hear it. It's a little bit of a click. I wouldn't say it's too hard. It's actually maybe kind of a pleasing amount of tactileness. Like you pressed it and you know you're not going to press it by accident, and you know that when you let go, it's going to respond properly. So I think in some ways, although it's not identical, this is preferable. Again, you can hear there's more of a tactile response with the B button on this controller. And again, the same thing with the Y and X. So all of these are a bit more tactile. They don't take an absurd amount of pressure to push at all. They don't feel mushy and they spring back nicely. So I think in some ways this might be preferable. But of course, if you just can't stand any difference at all, you're going to be unhappy. The start button, pretty similar, but this one's very mushy. This one is much more tactile. So just in general, the tactility of the front buttons is way superior on the G3. Now let's look at the orange C-stick. This GameCube controller's got a bit of wear on it. You can see that it does rattle around a bit. This is nice and tight. Now, of course, who knows what the relative levels of wear are, but this is a used controller, so it's definitely been used some. Now, clearly you can see that there's a difference in terms of the concavity. This is convex, this is concave. If you put your fingers on here and you push, I would say both hold onto your thumb equally, and if anything, it's harder for your thumb to slip off of this C-stick than it is here. So this is actually, I think, a win. It's obviously a different shape, but it feels pretty good. It's not the same kind of soft grip rubber. They're really relying on the shape to catch your finger. Maybe that's less good, but on the other hand, it's not going to wear out like this is. So I think this is actually a win too. Starting to sound like a PDP shell here, but you know, keep in mind that they don't make these anymore, so there's no one to pay me off here. Now, what about the main joystick? You can see that they're relying on a fairly different strategy here. This has got kind of like a noise texture. This has concentric rings. Both are kind of a soft grip rubber. And I would say that both feel good, both hold on to your thumb very nicely. This is very analogous to what you would get on a PS2 stick. So I think this is just as good as this. Unfortunately, that's about where the goodness of this G3 starts to go downhill. Specifically, this D-pad is a real problem. So, to be honest, the real D-pad is not great either. It's a little bit mushy, not a whole lot of tactile response, but it is pretty trivial to push the button, or excuse me, a direction, and get just a response in that direction. And that is not as true with the G3 controller. So this is very mushy. You don't have any sort of tactile response, and I have found, it's hard to demonstrate, but I've found that if I push right, for instance, it's not unheard of by any means for me to get a down response as well. So this is just not very good. This is, maybe not even as good as some of the generic controllers out there. So this part of the controller is just, it's not great. It's good enough though, I think, in a lot of cases, because what is this part get used for? Well, often it's used for things like selecting things in menus or whatever. And so tight, precise control isn't so important here. But if you're playing a game where this does need to be tight and clean and dependable, this G3 is not going to be a good use for you. Moving to the back, things get better again. Actually, these triggers here, they feel just basically identical. The same range, the same sort of clickiness at the end, really close. And this does actually respond over range. So if you're playing a game where a small pull causes an actual action, this will deliver that correctly. Now, as I was doing that, I was noticing there's a little bit of like a catching here. This maybe needs to be cleaned a little bit. But in general, in gameplay, I've not found that this has any problems at all. It feels good. It responds nicely. When it comes to the Z button, and as you can see, this one has a turbo button, things are not as sunny. So this it's reasonably tactile and springy on this side. Over here, it's not working so well. If you compare it to the original GameCube, this Z button has never actually been that great. There's really no tactileness at all here. Maybe on a different GameCube controller it would perform better, but it's kind of a mushy thing too. Doesn't mean you can't feel it, but it's not great. So actually, when pushing over here, this one is maybe slightly preferable. But when you're holding it, you don't push here, you push across the whole thing, and it's a little mushy. The mechanism in here, the spring-loaded part, tends to break. As you can see, it's happened quite badly over on this side here, this turbo button. It is depressible even in that state, but it's clearly very sad. And this actually brings me to an important point about longevity about these controllers. This mechanism seems to be weak. It's broken on both sides on this one. I was able to take it apart and glue the mechanism back together on this side. It's just a spring that slides into a little slot. On this one, it was too badly broken to do that. And so that meant that the spring was just floating loose inside this case. And it's a piece of metal. And so, in fact, when I plugged this in, it started to drive the rumble motor just instantly, which means there was some kind of short in the circuit caused by metal to metal contact. And eventually, because I didn't take it apart quickly enough and fix that problem, this controller has sort of stopped working. So if you have one of these, if you buy one of these and you plug in and it starts rumbling immediately, get it apart as soon as you can. Unplug it, take it apart, find the little piece of metal. It kind of looks like a little metal L shape that's about the size maybe of this Y button here. Get it out of there. Final conclusion here is I think this G3 controller is actually pretty good. The differences between it and the GameCube are not clearly one being objectively better than the other. They are not identical. One's not a clone of the other. That both are, I think, good controllers. And I think we can say with some confidence, given that these are available on the used market, they didn't just wear out immediately like the generic ones you can buy today. So this is going to give you some amount of gameplay. And honestly, it's hard to find these in good condition now, these real ones. So you might be able to buy, 3 or 4 of these PDP G3 controllers for the price of one GameCube controller. And, what's the likelihood that one of those G3s will be in great condition? Pretty high. And, to some extent, you can swap parts on these. Certainly you can replace the rubber or whatever. So I think these are actually a good buy today. In the days when you could buy these for the original MSRP, I would go for the GameCube controller for sure. But now that these are so inflated, I would go for this. And I would certainly go for this over these generic ones that look, perfect matches, but have such shoddy insides. That's my opinion. Take it for what it's worth.